Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Samuel Sinyangwe. Thank you, Sam.
Wow. It's great to be here. So first of all, thank you to Uzo, thank you to YouthREX for the opportunity to address you all. As was presented, I started this work actually focused on educational justice, trying to figure out how do we use data as a tool to improve outcomes for low-income kids and families in areas of concentrated poverty in the United States, working with the Federal Promise Neighborhoods program, which was one of the Obama administration's signature education initiatives. My job was to support communities, 61 federally funded community-based collaboratives, to build out data systems and structures to hold all partners accountable to delivering results for kids and families, to change outcomes, to improve kindergarten readiness, to improve academic achievement, to increase graduation in high school and college, and entering career. And then my life changed. On August 9th, 2014, Mike Brown Jr. was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. His death sparked a protest movement that has reverberated across the United States, sustained to this day, and indeed has impacted countries across the globe. But in those early days and weeks and months of the movement, there was a fundamental question around data. In particular, a question around police violence. As community members were saying that they had experienced police violence, that they personally had experienced police violence, they knew people who had experienced police violence, that for generations in communities they had experienced police violence. What we heard from many policymakers and academics and on channels like Fox News was this question sowing doubt, asking where is the data, attempting to dismiss the lived experience of community members by saying, where is the data? And until you have the data, we're not sure that an actual problem is occurring. Now, it wasn't a coincidence that there was no data. There was no data on people killed by police in the United States because the federal government continues, even to this day, not to collect comprehensive data on the subject. They could tell you how much rainfall there was in rural Missouri going back 200 years. They could not tell you how many people were killed by police last year or the year before. And the reason is actually, in part, a methodological issue. They were relying on 18,000 different police departments in the United States, each to submit data in a consistent and reliable way every single year. And each of those 18,000 jurisdictions had their own way of collecting and reporting data. Many did not report it at all. And so in large states like Florida, in the federal database, it showed that not a single person had been killed by police for 15 years. Now, a simple Google search shows that that's not true. And so I connected with activists on the ground in Ferguson, and together we built the most comprehensive database of police violence in the United States. We looked at local media reports, criminal records databases, using public records requests to police departments for police data. We looked at obituaries and social media profiles and aggregated all of that information together into a comprehensive data set that, according to the best research estimates, covers more than 98% of the total number of people killed by police in the country. Simply put, we did what the federal government had failed to do up to this point. But it's not enough to just collect data, to have a spreadsheet full of names and stories and situations and lives that have been lost to police violence. We needed to figure out how to make this data come to life, how to tell a story about what was happening in communities across the country, so that we could use the data to equip communities with the language and the knowledge and the research to make the case for change. And so we started by launching Mapping Police Violence, a platform that launched with this map, a map of people killed by police in the United States. So if you go to mappingpoliceviolence.org, you can see the current map. It's updated every week. So far, almost 900 people have been killed by police in the United States so far this year. Every single year we found, with data going back to 2013 to the present day, so more than 5 years of data now, we found that about 1,200 people are killed by police in the United States every year, between 3 and 4 people every day. And we also took a deep dive to understand how police violence was impacting particular communities and what accountability, if any, was happening as a result. What we found was disheartening. We found that in 97% of all cases where a police officer kills a civilian in the United States, no officers are charged with any crime. And in 99% of all cases, no officers are convicted. Now, even among that small number, that 1% of officers who are convicted, we also found that those officers got lesser sentences than civilians convicted of the same crimes. So for example, in Georgia, an unarmed black man was killed by a police officer, and for the first time in that state's history, they sentenced that police officer to a part-time prison sentence, only requiring him to serve time on the weekends because he was a police officer. So clearly there was no accountability whatsoever for police violence. Now, who was it impacting? We found that black people were 3 times more likely to be killed by police than their white peers. Indigenous populations, Latino populations, between 1.5 and 2 times more likely to be killed. We also found that people of color were more likely to be unarmed when killed by police, and these are underestimates because so often we have to rely on police narratives who are often the only witness at the scene. But based on what we can confirm, at least 16% of white people killed by police were unarmed compared to 23% of black people killed by police. So next we wanted to visualize this information by place. We know that place matters. There are 18,000 jurisdictions in the United States, each jurisdiction with its own set of policies and practices, its own jurisdictional authority and police chief, its own set of behaviors that need to change. And so we visualized the data for the 100 largest jurisdictions in the country. And what we found was a lot of variation in rates of police violence. Depending on where you lived, your risk of being harmed by a police officer was substantially different. What we found was that at the high end of that spectrum in cities like St. Louis, a black man was twice as likely to be killed by police officers as the average American was to be killed by anybody, civilian or police, twice as high as the US homicide rate. We found that in cities like Oklahoma City, 1 in 6 homicides were committed by a police officer. And nationwide, 1 in 3 people killed by a stranger in the United States is killed by a police officer. At the low end of the spectrum, we learned things as well. We learned that there were cities where police were not killing people. We learned that there were cities with police violence happening at very low, relatively low rates. So we wanted to learn what was happening in these places. What explained those low rates of police violence that we could learn from, that we could scale to other jurisdictions to address this issue across the country. And finally, paying attention to race, what you see on the right side, your right, is a visualization of unarmed people killed by police specifically over the past 5 years in major American cities, coded by race. What you see here with the red are black people killed by police, orange are Latinos, and gray are white people killed by police. What you see quite simply here is that almost every unarmed person killed by police in a major American city is a person of color, the majority of whom are black. So, we also found some data about Canada. Now, I will say that it was hard to come across this data. Doing some research in preparation for this talk, there wasn't a lot of data available similar to the United States. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done in this area as well to protect our youth, to protect our communities from this issue. And what we found in Canada is, in fact, that police violence is increasing over time, according to a CBC analysis of people killed by police. That, in fact, the rate of police violence in Canada is about 1/3 the rate of the United States, but again, increasing. We also found similar disparities in Canada as we see in the United States, with indigenous populations and black populations wildly overrepresented among those killed by police, and 70% of all people killed by police themselves being people who had struggled with mental health issues and substance abuse issues where there should have been another response. So, those are the facts. That's the data on the problem. But it's one thing to understand the problem, and it's another to figure out how to be part of the solution. And so, using data, we were able to identify a set of narratives. So when you have the data showing these racial disparities, what we often understand, what we often experience coming into rooms and talking about these disparities, is that there's a set of narratives that have been around for quite some time that attempt to dismiss these disparities as something other than an issue that police departments should pay attention to and address and are responsible for. Now, those narratives are quite easy to predict. They're things that you may have heard before. Certainly in the United States, you can't turn on a channel like Fox News without hearing these narratives all day, or listen to a speech from, unfortunately, our president without hearing these things. And those narratives go as follow: that police are using deadly force, particularly in black communities, because they're in violent situations in violent neighborhoods, having to defend themselves and others from harm from violent criminals. Those are the narratives that you hear to explain these rates of police violence again and again and again. Now, there's no evidentiary support for these narratives. They never bring data to those conversations. They are just accepted as facts because they have the authority as police officers and as politicians to say things and often not be questioned in the media. Now, in communities, we know this isn't true. And so with the data, we were able to equip activists and community members with the facts to be able to contest those narratives, to be able to bring evidence-based arguments to challenge and debunk those narratives systematically. So for example, we visualize rates of violent crime and rates of police violence in the 60 largest cities in the country. The red squares are rates of police violence, killings by police. And the blue X's are rates of violent crime. What you see here quite simply is that there's not a correlation between the two, that there are cities with very high rates of violent crime where there are violent and dangerous situations that people are encountering every day, where the police are not using deadly force, where the police are able to resolve these situations without killing people. And there are cities that have relatively low rates of violent crime with relatively high rates of police violence. The city with the second highest rate of police violence in the United States is the city where I'm from, Orlando, Florida. It is not the most dangerous city in the world, but yet police, for some reason, are using deadly force at extraordinary rates compared to other cities. Just to hit that point home, looking at the comparison between Orlando, Florida, and another city, Buffalo, New York, where between 2013 and 2016, despite having similar size populations, similar demographics, and similar crime rates, we saw police kill nobody in Buffalo, New York, and 15 people in Orlando, Florida over the same time period. So what is happening that's going right in Buffalo, New York that we can learn from and scale, and what's going wrong in Orlando, Florida that needs to change? Those are the questions that we started to ask, that communities started to ask now that we had this data. Using data to identify solutions. So we took the data on the outcomes, on police violence in all of these jurisdictions. We also obtained data on the policy and practice contributors to those situations. Things like, what are the use of force policies of those police departments? These are policies that determine how and when police are authorized to use force, what situations they can use force in, when they can use deadly force, for example. Also, we looked at policies around community oversight and community control of the police. Is there a community oversight structure? Does it have any power to investigate police misconduct? Can it hold police officers accountable? We looked at training information. What we found, interestingly there, was that the average police recruit gets 58 hours of training in firearms, learning how to shoot, and 8 hours in training in de-escalation, learning how not to shoot. We took information on civilian oversight. We took information on what laws were decriminalized or criminalized heavily in particular communities, on militarization of the police, on police union contracts, which contain the entire accountability structure oftentimes for police departments, what protections those officers have when they're under investigation for misconduct. And we did an analysis looking at the connection between those inputs and the outcomes that we were seeing. And what we found was shocking, and I'm going to focus on one of those areas, one of those 10 policy areas where we identified effective policies that were associated with reductions in police violence, and that area is use of force. So each police department has its own use of force policy in the United States. These policies differ wildly. We looked at the use of force policies for the 100 largest departments in the country, and what we found was something like this, a 5 or 10-page document that articulates when, where, and under what circumstances police officers are allowed to use force and how much force they're allowed to use. And I'm going to read word for word the use of force policy from the San Jose Police Department. This is a city in California with over 1 million population. Officers need not retreat or desist in the reasonable use of force. There is no requirement that officers use a lesser intrusive force option before progressing to a more intrusive one. That is the policy. Contrast that with Philadelphia Police Department. It is important for first responding officers to use caution, evaluate the situation, attempt to de-escalate the situation through communication, request a crisis intervention team trained officer if not personally trained, wait for backup, and await the arrival of a patrol supervisor before taking any action, barring a threat to life. Retreating or repositioning is not a sign of weakness or cowardice by an officer. It is often a tactically superior police procedure rather than the immediate use of force. The primary duty of all police officers is to preserve human life. Only the minimal amount of force necessary to protect life or effect an arrest should be used by an officer. Excessive and/or gratuitous force will not be tolerated. The application of deadly force is a measure to be employed only in the most extreme circumstances after all lesser means of force have failed or cannot reasonably be employed. This is literally the opposite policy as San Jose's. San Jose, no requirement to retreat or desist, no requirement to use a lesser degree of force before proceeding to a more intrusive one. Philadelphia, officers are very much required to do that. So, do these policies matter? This is a document on a 5-page piece of paper. Does this actually influence police behavior? So, working with legal experts, activists, researchers, youth, and students from across the country, we reviewed the policies of the 100 largest departments in the United States. We looked at what are the types of provisions within those policies that impose restrictions on how and when police can use force. And we identified 8 of those types of provisions. Things like whether it requires officers to use de-escalation, whether it requires officers to use a verbal warning before using deadly force, whether officers are required to use non-lethal force before using deadly force, whether they have to intervene if they see another officer using excessive force to stop that officer, whether they ban things like chokeholds and strangleholds. And what we found by visualizing this information here, and this is actually an interactive visualization, so community members can click on one of these policies. If it's blue, that means the department has it. If it's red, it doesn't. And they can actually see the language of the policy, the section of that policy document that needs to change. And what we found was that the average police department only had 3 of those 8 recommendations. That in fact there were departments that had none. And only one department, San Francisco, had all 8. And that's because they adopted and updated that policy in response to some of our recommendations last year. Now, do these policies matter? So we looked at the relationship between those policies and the outcomes, people being killed by police. What we found was that each of these 8 policies were associated with reductions in deadly force. Police departments that had these policies, simply put, were less likely to kill people than those that did not. So much so that departments, for example, that required de-escalation were 15% less likely to kill civilians. Departments that required officers to exhaust all other options and alternatives before using deadly force were 25% less likely to kill civilians. And departments that had multiple of these policies in place were the departments that had the lowest rates of deadly force overall. So much so that going from 0 of these policies to all 8, we saw a 72% reduction in deadly force by police, controlling for a variety of factors: demographics, crime rates, arrest rates, threats to police officers, etc. Now, it's important when doing this work and using the data to understand what the response might be from the officials whose opinions you're trying to change. And what we hear from the police is often a script. It's not hard to predict what they're going to say. I talked about the crime narrative. We've all heard that. There's another narrative around making changes, making reforms, changing the policies of police departments. And that narrative goes, if you impose new restrictions on how and when police can use force, you are going to prevent police officers from having all the tools at their disposal to defend themselves from threats or to enforce and reduce crime. Now, again, no evidence or data has ever been presented to establish that those things are true. They've just been sort of taken as true by too many. So we tested those things, and what we found was, in fact, they were not true. That departments that had the most restrictive use of force policies were actually those departments that were the safest for officers. They were those departments that did not have higher crime rates than departments that had less restrictive use of force policies. Simply put, the departments that have implemented these recommendations are safer for officers, are safer for civilians, and are safer for communities at large. Now, that's agency level, department level analysis, understanding what are the structural and systemic issues that need to change. We also have been able now to look at individual level data on individual officers. So this is actually an analysis from the Invisible Institute, one of our partners. They got access to all of the civilian complaints against Chicago police officers, all of the uses of force reported by Chicago police officers, and all of the misconduct lawsuits against Chicago police officers over the past 17 years. That's 30,000 officers they got data on, a huge data set. Now, what they found was that of those 30,000 officers, there were about 1,300 officers that had extraordinary rates of use of force, misconduct complaints, and lawsuit settlements compared to other officers. These were officers that were far more likely to use force against civilians, far more likely to be involved in misconduct. But what was also interesting is that they found that for new recruits, new officers that were placed on the same patrols and shifts as those officers, that were placed under the supervision of those more violent officers, those officers over time then themselves became more violent, started to become socialized in an environment and in a culture of violence. So much so that when visualizing this, they were able to show that police misconduct spreads through a department like a disease. That originally you start off with a small number of officers that commits a large number of misconduct, and because there are no accountability structures that are enforcing those violations, that are holding those officers accountable, that are removing those officers from the force, that then spreads misconduct to where 17 years later, you have a substantial number of officers involved in misconduct and a systemic issue throughout the department. So this allows us to have different types of interventions. Now we can target those interventions not only at the policy level, but also at the individual officer level, and think about what types of accountability structures need to be in place in order to prevent misconduct from spreading in departments. So we know the problem. We can precisely diagnose the problem. Now, how do we equip community members, youth, activists across the country to be involved in advocating for those changes? Now, we have been in rooms with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and informed their policy platforms, have been in rooms with police chiefs and policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels, and President Obama when he was still in power, and shifted policies in many of those contexts. But we're a small team, we're one organization. We cannot be in 18,000 jurisdictions at once. In order to get to transformational change, it requires thinking bigger than any organization or entity. It requires creating tools and platforms and having a strategy that is equipping people across the country to be part of that change, to have the data that they need to make the case for change to policymakers who often will not listen to lived experience, but when you bring data into the room, will suddenly have something that they cannot say no to. It requires having tools that make it easier for people to identify who their elected officials are and to engage those officials effectively. And so one of the ways that we've been able to solve this problem has been launching this basic Typeform survey. If you don't know about Typeform, it's a great website to build an interactive survey for not a lot of money. We launched a survey that basically asked people what kind of work did they want to do? How many hours did they have to do that work? And where were they located? So they could sign up to review policy information like those use of force policies I showed you. They could sign up to track and collect data. They could sign up to track legislation. We're tracking in all 50 states and most large cities. And from that, we had 18,000 people sign up in 2 weeks. We were able to connect those people, this was in 2015, connect those people to activists and researchers who could help supervise them and train them on how to review policy documents. And from that work, we were able to create all of what I've showed you. We were able to create that use of force project in less than a month because we had people in every one of those cities reviewing the policies for their police departments, understanding how to read through a policy document and look for statements around issues like de-escalation. Anybody can look through a 5-page document and identify which statement involves the word de-escalation. Simple Control F on your computer. We had people looking through the policies of their community oversight boards and the policies of their police union contracts. And from that, we had designers and developers who signed up who were able to build that interactive grid and that website that I then showed you. All of this was a collaborative effort. And from doing that, from involving hundreds and thousands of people across the country in that effort, we were able to train people. So now it's not just one organization that knows about this work. We have people all across the country and cities all across the country trained to understand these policies that can walk into a room with the police chief and be just as articulate and effective in advocating for change as any one of us. And that is the strategy where we can get to transformational change, thinking bigger about how do we equip everybody through our data, through making this accessible to everyone, so that they can be part of that change too. Here's another tool that we're able to develop to make that advocacy process a little bit easier. You input your address or zip code. It shows you who your local, state, and federal representatives are, what votes they've taken on past police reform measures, and then allows you to contact them. The whole process takes 3 clicks or less. Before this, you had to know who your representatives are, which most people don't know their local and state representatives. You had to know what bills had been proposed over the past several years to address this issue, which I didn't know, had to do research for a month to figure that out. And then you had to know what their contact information was and how they voted on those bills in order to reach them. That is an impossible task to ask of everyday people. So what we did was collect the data, make this accessible, and because we were able to build that tool, we had 100,000 people use it to contact their representatives. Results. So over the past several years, doing this advocacy work, supporting local organizations on the ground to organize and turn out people into city council hearings and state legislative hearings to push for change. We've seen the majority of US states sign legislation that addresses at least one of the 10 recommendations within our policy platform. Now, this looks good, but we still have a long way to go, because we know that there is no silver bullet solution. There is no one solution to this issue. You can have amazing policies, but if you do not enforce them and have a strong accountability structure, what good is that? If you can have amazing policies, but then if you are not effectively training police officers and equipping them to actually follow those policies, there are still deficiencies there. And so there's a lot of work to do. Only a handful of states have implemented comprehensive legislative packages to address this issue. But we're doing better than we were doing before 2014. And we're starting to see results. This is an analysis of major cities that have changed their use of force policies in response to advocacy. Now, what we see here is a reduction of 30% in police shootings the year after those changes were enacted. Those are lives saved. This is actually saving lives and making a difference through this data collection, through this analysis, through this organizing, through making it accessible, through understanding how to get past some of the narratives and arguments that have obstructed progress to date. That's how we can get to actually winning policies and saving lives. Now, this isn't unique to police violence. This is something that we encounter all across the world and in so many issues that we encounter and want to address. And I'll close with this. There are 104 million Americans that currently support the Black Lives Matter movement. That's according to Pew Research surveys. What proportion of that large number of people are currently involved in the work? It's a tiny proportion. It's on the order of maybe thousands, but there are 104 million people. Our success will depend on the extent to which we can create pathways for as many of those people as possible to be involved in the work. For people to be involved using their unique skill sets, their unique background and experience, to connect in and leverage that in order to create systemic and transformational change. I think we're on the cusp of doing that. We've engaged thousands, not millions. So how do we actually get to scale? That's the challenge that we need to solve, and it's not unique to police violence. It is the case in so many of the issues that we care about. If we're going to address issues of concentrated and systemic poverty, we have to figure out pathways for everybody to be involved in creating transformational change, building out systems of opportunity, similar to the work that I was doing with Promised Neighborhoods, but scaling that so it's accessible for everybody, not just organizational leaders, not just systems leaders, but community members as well and youth. That's the work that YouthREX is doing. This is the work that we need to invest in and scale moving forward. We're doing the right work. We have to build on the lessons learned, use the new technologies that we have access to now to make that work go further and faster, and then get to the change that we all know needs to happen as quickly as possible. That's how we win. So thank you for listening to me. I hope that you all stick around and have a wonderful time at this event. I'm looking forward to it. I love YouthREX. From my 3 days that I've been here, I've learned a lot about Canada and the situations that you all are experiencing, and I'm hopeful that I can add value to that experience as well. So thank you.
So I can take this opportunity to maybe ask Samuel a question. So if anyone would like, just raise your hand and over the mic.
I'm back.
Back to the first website that you point out that you collect, that is recruit different people in a wide variety of communities to collect data, and then how do you manage to, that is after the data is collected, how do you manage to validate those data? Because I believe the government or other authorities will question that. That is whether those data is not biased and accurate.
Yep.
Not accurate, but genuine.
Yeah, great question. So we do that through a commitment to transparency. All of our data is publicly available for download. We've been around for 3 years. If there were issues with the data, they would have probably taken us down by now. In part, one of the things that we have done through making this data available is allowed new researchers, others to take it and do their own analyses, which has been so powerful. So for example, this data set at the Mapping Police Violence website, not only are we including all of the data, but also all the source information, links to all of the sources for that data, for each of those records, just to make sure that that everything is accurate and correct. What we also have done, though, with researchers is, we don't know everything that we don't know everyone who wants to use the data, uses it for their own purposes. What we do know are the studies that have come out from people who have done that. So for example, somebody in Berkeley, a researcher in Berkeley, took our data set and was able to establish that incidents of police violence have an impact on Black mental health at the population level. So that in fact these issues not only impact the individual who is harmed by police, but actually traumatize entire communities. And so the data showed that when an incident of police violence occurs, for the Black population in that entire state, there is worse mental health for a sustained period following that incident. So this has been useful to public health advocates to think of this in the context of the work that they do. So that's just one example, but in all of the information that I showed you, it's publicly available. The data on the outcomes as well as the policy information. You click on that, you see the actual section of the policy, the language of the policy, and a link to the policy. And that's very important, not only for making sure that we're accurate, but also making sure that others can use this data for their own purposes.
Have you done any research that breaks down this issue into age demographics, looking at how maybe youth specifically are affected by police violence?
Yes. One of the things that we have seen is that this is very different depending on race, right? So for white people killed by police, they tend to skew older. They tend to be more likely to have mental health issues and more likely to be in sort of domestic situations. We know for younger people, people of color are much more overrepresented. That in fact, particularly for young Black men, there is a wild overrepresentation at the younger end of the spectrum. We also know from survey research that 54% of Black youth in the United States have personally experienced police violence or know somebody personally who has, 54%. It is not anywhere close to that for white youth. So there is quite a bit of data on how this impacts youth. We also know in the context of school-based policing, where school-based police officers are much more likely to be in schools where there are predominantly kids of color, are much more likely to be arresting students of color for minor offenses. So the school-to-prison pipeline feeds into this. We know that that's true, and are continuing to do work to build on that base of research.
I was just wondering if you could speak a bit to the process of accessing the data that you need in the first place to fill that gap. So what were some of the barriers? How big was the team? How long did it take?
Yeah, so the majority of the information, sort of the backbone of the database, relies on media reports. When somebody is killed by police, it is a homicide, and it is more often than not reported in the media. According to research estimates, it's reported in the media at least 98% of the time. There is a gap there of 2% that we are conscious of, particularly in rural areas, indigenous reservations. There is an underreporting because there's not sort of the media infrastructure to report some of that. But overall, it tends to be reported. And that is where we find the information, and then we follow up with other sources to find additional information. So information on race, we can get sometimes through criminal records databases and also through obituaries, social media profiles of people who had been killed. We also are have looked at police data, police records, where it'll also have information on, for example, the officers involved, information if there are things that the police department has found that did not get reported, then we can fill those gaps through that. So that's sort of the process. In terms of how we've been able to collect it, we have people all across the country that have set up a system of Google alerts where tied to particular keywords. So for example, officer-involved shooting, police shooting, that are able to find these articles when they come out, are notified of them, and then start to input those in the database. And since we've launched, actually, the two large media organizations, The Guardian and The Washington Post, has used this methodology to create their own databases. So now we're able to leverage their staff and their time and resources to be able to do some of this work as well, which has been really helpful.
Hi. Thank you for your what you said. I just wanted to know, based on your your cradle to career program, how do you use your data to inform your work with that? Like in terms of solutions for the worst mental health or worsened mental health for police killings. I just kind of want to have some insight about that.
Yeah, I mean, so around the mental health issue, one of the things that we have advocated for has been a shift away from involving the police in every mental health crisis and every substance abuse issue. We find that a significant proportion of people who end up being killed by police were going through mental health issues, were going through emotional health crises, and police are not well trained to deal with that. But there are people who are well trained to deal with that, mental health providers. And there are examples of cities that now deploy mental health providers to calls involving a mental health crisis, but they deploy them with the police, which, again, is often counterproductive. But there are approaches that work. There are significantly fewer, about 40% fewer incidents, use of force incidents involving a mental health provider and a police officer responding to a call like that compared to just a police officer. So that's one strategy for dealing with these broader issues of mental health in the context of police violence. The other issue, of course, on the sort of back end after an incident occurs, how are communities healing? How are communities processing? That is an issue for public health professionals, for folks who are mental health providers, or folks who are social workers dealing with clients, to understand that these factor into people's psyche, right? When an incident of police violence occurs, that is something that impacts their mental health. That's something that needs to be addressed and talked about and processed, and people need treatment and care for those things. But I think ultimately the way that we fix this issue is by ending police violence in the first place.
Hi, I have a question about the transformative action piece. Because what I'm noticing in the past few years is that a lot of the data for arguments are there, but those narratives that you were kind of talking about are often just as strong or even stronger, and that people don't necessarily look at the evidence the same way, or they look for flawed and biased arguments that kind of support what they already believe and aren't necessarily interested in changing that. So I'm just wondering, through making it more accessible for people to advocate, how do you then reach those people who are in positions of power to enact that change, if they don't already kind of buy into it?
Yeah. Well, so I think there are a couple of strategies, and we're by no means the only people involved in this work. There are organizations all across the U.S., people who have taken to the streets by the thousands, if not millions, who have put a lot of pressure on those officials to change whether or not they like that, whether or not they believe that in these issues. And that's really important to the work, right? I don't think that we can get through all of this with persuasion alone. Oftentimes we need to change who those elected officials are. And so we've seen in cities like Cleveland and Chicago, we've seen elected prosecutors get voted out of office. We've seen police chiefs change over in many cities, and that's a big part of the strategy as well. But I do think that oftentimes we make it too easy on those elected officials when they can simply ask, where is the data, and we let the conversation shut down right there. And what I found is that oftentimes they are so rarely challenged with actual data to contest their preconceived notions and beliefs that providing that data actually puts them in a situation where now they don't know how to respond and creates space for a solutions conversation that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
Any other questions? Thanks so much, man. Really amazing. I really appreciate it. I think I'm kind of really interested in the piece of the work around equipping communities to actually engage in this kind of work. I work mostly in the Indigenous context here in my own communities, and a lot of the data collected for communities is like super unreliable in the sense like even we know, for example, in places like Toronto, the population is, that the government reports is vastly lower than what our own communities are reporting. But then we also don't have necessarily the capacity and infrastructure built in our communities across the country to take the data that's out there and actually put out this kind of work to really make change and advocate for things. So I'd love to hear how you've kind of engaged community to build that kind of capacity to make this kind of work happen.
Yeah, so a lot of our initial engagement was on Twitter and other social media channels, really being able to reach people where they are. So a lot of youth are getting their information and their news from Instagram, from Twitter, from Snapchat, and we design all of our content to be accessible on those platforms so that it doesn't take you a long time to understand the data point. We recognize that for most youth, they are scrolling up their timeline on their phone, and they have maybe 3 seconds to scroll up past whatever article or report or information you want to provide. And if you can't teach them something in those 3 seconds, you have lost 90% of your audience, because actually you've lost 98% of your audience, because only 2% will click through to the content itself. And then the content itself has to be in a format where people can understand, where there are clear things that they can take and repeat in a meeting, right? So, for example, in Cleveland, one of the statistics that we produced was that 67% of people killed by Cleveland police were unarmed. So just a simple statistic like that is really powerful and something that somebody can then take into a conversation with an elected official. So that's sort of been part of the strategy for making this accessible, and then also complementing that sort of digital strategy with on-the-ground strategies as well. So working with, for example, I've gone to classrooms of high schoolers, college students, and helped them understand the data, presented some of this to them. As well as equipping activists. I think a big part of this is, we can't be in every room, we can't be in every community, but what we can do is make sure that activists know how to use this data, can incorporate this data in their work. So we've done analyses, for example, for the Dream Defenders in Florida, we did a custom analysis for Florida that they then used in their youth organizing work there. Those are a range of strategies that we've used to reach people. And we have been successful. I think there is a misconception around youth and data, that youth are unfamiliar with data or don't know how to use data. I think when you really look at what youth are doing every day, oftentimes it involves data. They're on social media. There are a whole range of metrics they're monitoring on social media around follower counts and reach. You look at video games. There's a whole dashboard of statistics, any sports game, any role-playing game. So folks know how to use data on the issues that they care about. What hasn't happened well enough, I think, is making the issues that impact their everyday lives, the social issues, just as accessible via data as some of these other issues have been. So that's sort of the challenge that we've sought to solve.
Hi, I guess I'm just wondering what results you've come across that maybe didn't fit with other results you came across, or anything that seemed most surprising and then sort of challenged previous beliefs that you maybe had going into it.
Yeah. Great question. I think one of the things that has been interesting is this relationship between mental health and who's being impacted by police violence, and that finding that I talked about around white communities actually being more likely to be in mental health crisis and then be killed by police. That's something that I didn't think would be the case. As we know, mental health issues and the environmental stressors tend to disproportionately impact communities of color. And so that was a surprising finding.
I want to thank Sam one more time. Round of applause.
Thank you.